This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country, and we join their calls for justice.
What advice would you give new king? What would you like to see him do?
Do a backflip.
Hey, everyone, you know how politicians are always doing backflips? It's annoying, right?
Yeah, I hate that.
U-turns and backflips. Well, I'll tell you one politician who won't be doing the metaphorical kinds of backflips, but will be doing other kinds of backflips.
Uh-huh.
Have I lost you already?
Go on.
That is the Tasmanian Greens local council candidate for Deputy Mayor of Kingborough Council, Gideon Cordova.
Politicians are always doing backflips, but the only type of backflip you'll see me do is one of these. Vote 1, Gideon Cordova.
Authorised by G. Cordova, Tasmanian Greens, Hobart.
Gideon, first of all, what a name.
More like Gideon bend over backwards.
More like giddy up. More like I'm giddy after all the backflipping. Right?
So I thought this is really cute and kind of sweet. He graduated from NIDA. He's a community activist. He's on the board of Gymnastics Tasmania and formerly of the ABC Advisory Council. As we mentioned last week, local council elections in Tasmania are underway, so people can vote for it. He's running for the deputy mayor. And yeah, he did. I mean, he wanted to show people that he could do a backflip, I think, and then probably worked backwards from there, so to speak.
Worked backwards from there, you think?
Flip backwards from there.
I don't understand why this tweet doesn't have more likes. This is great content.
People should get out there. He's put on YouTube. It's got 11 views there.
Okay. How did you find this?
I don't know. It just came up on my Twitter feed. I think I started following anyone who said anything about the Greens ever.
Or acrobatics.
Or acrobatics as well. My two great loves together at last.
Your two kings.
I just think it's slightly confusing. It's just sort of like differentiating between the kind of backflips that politicians do and the ones that you really do yourself. I don't know. It's kind of cool. I still don't know how I feel about it. It's complicated.
I think it's really clever. Well done, Gideon.
Well done, Gideon. Go to gideoncordova.com.au to find out more and to help out with his campaign. Can you do a backflip?
No, okay. I was obsessed with doing a backflip when I was little because I did circus, which is like the thing that you do when you grow up in Mullum. It's like a thing. And I was very good at circus, but for some reason I really struggled with the backflip. I think I didn't have enough upper body strength. And I remember spending probably, like way beyond class had finished. I would just be on this mat in the gym, just trying to do a backflip over and over and over and over and just like collapsing on my arms. And I did it, I think once I managed to jump, land on my hands, hold it and like flip over. It was a bit of a disjointed. I've done one backflip in my life, but I was obsessed with it. It was the one thing I couldn't do. So no. And maybe that's just because I have such great political integrity.
She literally can't backflip.
I physically cannot.
Talk about the Greens, that bunch of idiots.
If you want the dole for life, free marijuana, vote Greens.
These people, these Greens, they are snake oil salesmen.
They're a bunch of breathbags and a bunch of idiots, and I've got no time for them whatsoever.
Frankly, I've always found the Greens to be a real serious danger to Australia.
Serious danger to Australia.
Well, welcome to the show, everybody. This is A Serious Danger, a podcast about Greens politics in Australia. It is not an official Greens Party podcast. There will be no backflips on the show. It is made possible with the help of the Green Institute and produced by Michael the Griffin. This week, we are chatting about Labor doing things that might be good. What?
Huh? What does that mean? Fuck? What do we do?
Are they going to do their own backflip?
Maybe. They're built different.
You can rate review the show at Apple Podcasts. Give us a 5-star rating. Go on. Do it. That really helps spread the word of the show. We'd appreciate it. Costs you nothing.
We would
appreciate that very much. You can support the show on Patreon, patreon.com/seriousdangerau, like these lovely people have. Our new patrons are Kristen, Joshua, Allison, Chris Wallace, Christopher Dyer, Ishtar, Tom, Hillary McAllister, Victorian Greens candidate for the seat of Polwarth. Still don't know how to pronounce it.
That's
Polwarth.
Polwarth?
It's, southwest Victoria, around near the Great Ocean Road and the 12 Apostles. I did a comedy gig for Western Victoria candidates on the weekend. Hillary was there, spoke brilliantly. Thanks for supporting the show, Hillary. Aaron Wilson, Justin, Phil, and Jake, thank you so much. For just $3 a month, you can help support the show and you'll get some sweet, sweet bonus content, like the forthcoming episode we're recording with Cam Wilson. Cam Wilson's coming back on the show to give us the lowdown on CPAC 2022.
I'm so excited for this.
I can't wait.
Oh, those crazy cats. They want us to die. They want to kill us. And that's funny.
And they're getting better at comedy, and the left is getting nervous.
I am. I sure am.
Follow us on social media too, at Serious Danger AU on Twitter, Instagram. Subscribe on YouTube, please. Share around our channel, that'd be great. Or for all your Serious Danger needs, go to seriousdangerpod.com. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Watch me backflip. Watch me backflip. Let me work my magic. Let me work my magic. Watch me backflip.
All right. Potential backflip alert. Here we go. Gideon, you'll love this.
Gideon, ready, flip.
Anthony Albanese holds the government's new line on stage 3 tax cuts.
Well, the government hasn't changed our position.
Hasn't changed, but will it?
Is that a guarantee there will be no changes to the stage 3 tax cuts?
That is exactly what I have said is that the government has not changed our position.
The budget is due to be handed down on October 25th. We're 3 weeks away from the first budget from the Albanese Labor government. It's not going to be easy under Albanese. Do you
call it the Albanese Labor government?
Yeah, and I call it the Greens political party.
I don't like the whole calling the government by the name of the leader, like the premier or the prime minister thing.
Well, I feel like in Australia it helps because you really need to keep up with who the fuck is the prime minister at any one given day.
I guess so. Okay, sure. Go ahead.
This week there's been a lot of speculation that the Albanese Labor government might be reconsidering the old stage 3 tax cuts. Very interesting.
Stage 3.
Now, do we like these? Are these good or bad? Emerald, just remind the listeners, are the stage 3 tax cuts a good thing or are they a bad thing?
You didn't prepare me for this. What's my line?
The Greens have internal party processes. It's all being dealt with. There you go. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I think that's it. They're bad. They're bad. Tax cuts, the stage 3 tax cuts for the rich are bad.
Real bad. They're going to cost $243 billion. I know people know this. They overwhelmingly benefit rich men.
Wait,
if you're earning...
we say 244. Why do other people say 243 and we say 244?
Yeah, I know. I can't keep track of that. I also read another article this week
$1
that sort of said...
is like a lot of money. So, but I guess that just goes to show how fucking massive this is. That it can be a difference of $1 billion, and that's not even that much.
Give or take $1 billion, yeah. If you're earning over $200K a year, you're getting a sweet $9,000 a year tax cut. Of course, that means all the politicians in Canberra, including Greens MPs, who are now class traders. The package also flattens the tax system. They make it less progressive, all for the benefit of the rich, and it's going to make us a more unequal society, which is bad, as we are quite an unequal society at the moment. They were opposed in principle by Labor back in 2018. They tried to split the tax package when the coalition tried to pass it so that they could just do the tax cuts for lower and middle income earners. That didn't happen, so then they voted for the whole package anyway because they didn't want to be seen against the tax relief for the middle income earners, and now they've backed it in ahead of the 2022 election because it's all about its certainty. That's what we need.
So when they backflipped that time, it was okay, but then if they backflip, they couldn't backflip again because that would be a bad backflip. But that was a good backflip when it was bad, when they voted for the bad thing.
Correct. What has changed recently is the fact that the new British Tory PM, Liz Truss, got very excited about passing sudden, massive, unfunded tax cuts for the rich and basically crashed the UK economy and made it shit its pants, set it into meltdown. The markets lost their fucking minds. The pound was crashed. It's the lowest the pound has ever been in relation to the US dollar in history. And she had to U-turn. In the UK, they call it U-turns, not backflips. But she had to immediately do a U-turn and
She had to U-a-dooey. I like saying that. I'm going to U-a-dooey. She had to U-a-dooey.
And a chuck a U-turn, innit?
Yeah, chuck a U-y.
It's all apples and pears. Or
whatever. Are we English or Australian?
I don't know.
Back to the Republic conversation again.
Oh,
just kidding.
So that's been happening. The Greens have pointed out that the stage 3 tax cuts in Australia are going to cost 3 times as much as Truss's cuts. The UK Tories have looked at the global economic outlook and decided that tax cuts are political poison, but Australian Labor apparently still requires convincing, said Adam Bant. Continuing ahead with the stage 3 tax cuts is economic vandalism, moving us closer to a flat tax system while also risking UK-style economic damage.
Mm-hmm.
Mixed in with that is a broader, generally very bad economic outlook for global conditions. A global recession is like quite probable at this point, so it's all bad. So a lot of people saying that all this news, UK situation, broader outlook, yada, 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 is building pressure, and maybe Labor is throwing around some ideas that maybe the tax cuts could be amended or abandoned.
Treasurer Jim Chalmers appearing to build the case today.
When it comes to the tax cuts, when it comes to cost of living relief, it should be targeted on people on low and middle incomes.
Should we hope, Emerald? Are things possible? Could this actually occur?
My strategy is, no, I shouldn't say my strategy is never hope. This is meant to be a hopeful podcast, but it's true. My personal strategy is never hope and then be pleasantly surprised. I reckon we're going to get into this, right? Like, it'll be somewhere in between. That's the classic Labor strategy. Not scrapping, but maybe not keeping entirely.
A little bit of fiddling, you say, bit of amending.
Yes.
Well, that also seems like it's also sort of the time-wise, whether they would need to make a clear decision at this next October budget when the tax cuts don't come until 2024. Potentially
true.
they could sort of just delay a little bit further as well.
Mm-hmm.
Adam certainly thinks that it could happen. He said, we're on the brink of a moment with the government's stage 3 tax cuts. There's growing unrest within the government about funding massive tax cuts for the rich. Keep up the pressure. This could be the first time in decades that a campaign to stop unfair tax cuts has won. He gives shout-outs to the Greens, unions, social services, peak bodies. Progressive economists agree that these things need to be dumped. So he's hoping. He's like hanging on to hope.
I mean, that's his job.
Sure.
Why they paying the big bucks to hope.
Yes. That's why he's getting a $9,000 tax cut.
Exactly.
I found it, reading around this, it's very hard to figure out what the fuck like Labor's position is at. And like all this hope and like, yeah, Labor's really thinking about it, they're doing it. And then on multiple occasions, senior Labor figures saying our position has not changed. We have not changed our position on stage 3, said Finance Minister Katie Gallagher. But we are finalising a budget, and I think the Treasurer and I have been upfront with some of the challenges and some of the changes we've been seeing in the economy that are front of mind for us, and we can't ignore those. And we won't ignore. Yeah, fucking hell.
Like music starts playing in my head when you're.
I know it's just like this shit you can't get through.
Is that intentional? Right? Like.
Oh, they're definitely trying to deliberately bore us out of our minds.
Yeah.
I like this one. The Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, says he's prepared to make the right decisions, even if they are politically difficult, preparing the ground for changes.
I'm just going to say it. I'm prepared to make the right decisions. I am.
I'm pretty brave. Finally, a politician is prepared to say it.
Prepared to make the right decisions.
I also love that because it's like, if you want to do the right decision, you would have opposed the stage 3 tax cuts ahead of the election. But no, that was too politically difficult, and Labor doesn't believe in its ability to have any sort of political fight whatsoever, and so they need to cave to the Tories' framing of shit. That would have been my take. We're sticking to the plan we took to the election, assured the Assistant Minister for Treasury, Andrew Lee, Mr. Inequality, by the way. It's important for the integrity of the democracy. That's simply vital.
The democracy. Okay.
Okay, bro. So, I mean, obviously they're laying the groundwork. There is a lot of talk. They're throwing out these ideas and sort of testing the waters a little bit to see what kind of appetite there is there for how much change we could sort of cut through here.
Yeah.
What do you think the strategy is here? Do you think they're just trying to sort of drip feed it, try to lay down the suggestion, maybe get some talk going about dumping the tax cuts and then come out with a altered version or amended version of the tax cuts so they seem like they're in the sensible centre? I don't know. What are you thinking here?
I think potentially, yeah, they could be testing the waters to see how people respond when there's like a hint that they might scrap the tax cuts. I think the interesting question here, and you've put in this quote from David Spears, where he says that over recent days, the Albanese government has engaged in what's known as kite flying, floating the prospect of changing the stage 3 plans without ruling anything in or out, testing reactions. And my question for us is like, is there an argument that if the coverage of reconsidering the tax cuts heavily involves the Greens and the idea that that would be like a Greens win and this is something that the Greens want to do, does that jeopardize our chance of actually winning this because Labor doesn't want that? And they're testing to see whether they can do this and get away with it politically or whether it would risk like ceding ground to the Greens.
Yeah, I mean, again, both the Greens can be a threat to Labor's left and also a useful tool, particularly for the Labor right. They can use the Greens' position as something to define themselves against and say, hey, at least we're not the crazy Greens. We're doing this thing that's slightly closer to the centre or further right. Which, again, is infuriating. I was talking with a friend about this yesterday. The centre ground with these fucking tax cuts is not a little bit of these tax cuts for rich people. It's like
exactly.
The tax cuts is flat out trickle down right wing batshit ideology, and Labor should be opposed to them to their very bones and their very core if they care about inequality in this country. Okay, but they don't. They care more about winning power and holding on to power. So they backed them in. They didn't want that fight, and so now they've got to present some kind of reasonable solution to this whole thing is to give them just a little bit of a tax cut, even though there's some of the wealthiest people in the country, and we've got 3 million Australians living in poverty, and people on Centrelink payments are living below the poverty line. So, again, that's a fucking brutal and infuriating reality of Australian political debate, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think we kind of made this distinction. We were talking about the climate bill and the argument about whether the Greens failed in accepting something that was not ultimately what they wanted. And I was like, I think it is, that's a fair critique, but it's important to distinguish between a negative change that will make things even worse than they already are and something that's not making things as much better as they need to be. And any version of these tax cuts is a change for the worse.
Well, here's a potential alternative. And I listened, according to the 7am podcast this morning, this is potentially in the mix as the kind of tweaking that we'd be talking about. This originally came from independent economist Chris Richardson, suggested keeping the 37% tax rate for incomes above 120,000K. So in the flattening of the tax cut, we were getting rid of this 37 rate, and everyone who's making between 45K and 200K, everyone's paying 30 cents on the dollar in taxes, right? Everyone above. So if you do, it's so good. Everyone above that would still receive a tax cut, just not as generous as Stage 3 currently provides. This would bring down the cost from $21 billion in the initial year to $12 billion a year. Quite a saving. Good economics, good politics, says Richardson. Again, sensible centre. And this would reduce the tax cut to the highest income earners to $3,000. So instead of a $9,000 tax cut, they're just getting $3,000.
Yeah.
Now, I quite like Adam's response to this. He said, in a situation where you're talking about should Clive Palmer get a $9,000 a year tax cut or a $6,000 a year tax cut, the answer is that Clive Palmer should get no tax cut. The simplest solution is not to go ahead with these tax cuts that are skewed towards the top end.
Yes. Yes.
Go off, King.
I mean, obviously.
Obviously, that's the answer. I mean, I'm so frustrated at the way that this is almost exclusively talked about as a political issue and a political headache for Labor. So few politicians want to ask, hey, what will these tax cuts do to our society? Like, let's actually talk about the impact of what they're going to do, and how much they're going to exacerbate inequality. Every time these charges have been brought out, these are going to benefit men overwhelmingly compared to women. Here's all the things that you could afford to pay if you didn't go through with these tax cuts, this stuff. Like, all of that is almost dismissed or subsumed by the larger political game debate amongst Canberra Press Gallery and the way the Labor responds to it, that we actually lose sight of the actual impact and the turbocharge of inequality that these tax cuts are going to lead to,
Which also still assumes that Labor has to, or the onus is on them to legislate these tax cuts when it's really not. And I actually don't think it's that much of a an electoral risk, a public opinion risk to them to scrap these fucking tax cuts. Maybe it's a political risk to them in that the people that fund their campaigns and that they actually align themselves with would be annoyed because it's wealthy people. It's fucking people with the capital.
Well, look, the promise is the thing that is cited regularly as the barrier to Labor changing this approach. This is David Crowe writing for the SMH. Nobody wants to be the next Liz Truss. Every political leader is now on notice to exercise extreme caution when unveiling a policy that assumes global investors will happily sign up for more sovereign debt. But nobody wants to be the next Julia Gillard or Tony Abbott either. The former Labor Prime Minister broke her election promise on a carbon price, and the former Liberal Prime Minister broke his promise to avoid spending cuts in health and education. What happens to Albanese if he breaks his promise on the new tax cuts? Emerald?
Okay, it is true that when you door knock, talking to voters, one of the biggest things that they will say about politicians is that they break promises and that's why they hate them all. Yeah. But I just don't actually think that conception that an ordinary person would have of politicians breaking promises is the same as what Labor people are talking about here or what fucking like media commentators are talking about. Like, I think that actually the examples that have been given here are where a government or a prime minister has made a promise generally to industry and to capital. And then when they break that promise, there is a massive, like well-funded, well-resourced, backed in by mainstream media campaign against that political party, which then influences the perception of that party in the eyes of the public and of ordinary people. It's not ordinary people just closely following what's happening in Parliament and realizing that the government has introduced like a taxation change that really may not even necessarily affect them. It's actually not about ordinary people at all. And I really doubt that there are that many people who are like, yeah, I voted for Labor because of the stage 3 tax cuts. Or like when I think about Labor's platform, if you ask an ordinary person, what did Labor talk about going into the election? Are they really going to say, oh, tax cuts? No.
Some cabinet ministers believe it is too late to change the tax cuts. In their view, a promise is a promise. The fact that workers on more than $180,000 receive about half the entire tax cut by dollar value, a finding from the Australian Institute, has not changed this. For these ministers, it is not about whether the tax cuts are fair, but about whether they were an election pledge. Fucking brutal. Backbench MPs have expressed mixed views on the fate of the tax policy, with several publicly calling on Wednesday for the government not to break a perceived election pledge. The MP for the Sydney seat of Macarthur, Mike Freelander, said the government had made promises and we need to stick to them, and said those earning $200,000 a year were well off but not rich.
Well off but not rich. What every fucking rich person thinks of themselves.
Yes.
Yeah, we're well
Mike Freelander
off.
is a doctor. You'll be surprised
We're
to
not
know.
rich.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
We've made promises and people have planned on the promises we made, and I think we should stick with them. Now, I mean, I think it's certainly true that if they do this, even if they make just an amendment in some way, of course Dutton and the Liberals are going to campaign against it. Like this is politics. Like I don't know how people think they can get through politics and being in government without being attacked by their political enemies.
Well,
if that is the case, then you're not fucking doing it right.
Yeah, because Dutton and the Liberals want the tax cuts because they're a liberal party. They're a neoliberal party. So
That's what they want.
Tax cuts.
And you're supposed to be different to that if possible.
Yeah, they should campaign for that.
Listen to this coward. One cabinet minister who asked not to be identified said curbing the tax cuts would give opposition leader Peter Dutton a line of attack on integrity and deal the coalition back into the game. Peter Dutton lacks an issue, the minister said. Fuck you. Jesus Christ. You don't care about anything, do you?
So pathetic.
You don't care about anything. This is all a game to you. You don't give a fuck. And you want that $9,000, don't you, you little cabinet minister?
Yeah, you fucking cabinet minister. Oh, but we can't do it because Peter doesn't.
What I will say, I think, is a fair critique is that people have sort of pointed out that there is a difference between the two situations. So some people are saying that the UK tax cut situation isn't totally analogous because they announced out of nowhere. It was crazy. The UK
is it
economy.
Analogous or analogous? No, analogous? Analogous.
It's not analogous. It's unanalogous. That's the word.
Why is it an analogy, but it's analogous?
Analogous. We'll do two takes. It's not analogous. It's not analogous to the UK because like they announced that out of nowhere and it was the sudden shock that affected the market so badly and that kind of thing, which as opposed to stage 3 tax cuts, which have been legislated years in advance. So that's probably a fair enough point, really, but it still doesn't make tax cuts for rich people good.
Yeah, tax cuts still bad. Sorry.
But look, we talked about public opinion and hey, what do you know it? The public don't give a fuck about election promises so much as not giving away hundreds of billions of dollars to the wealthiest people in society. It's so weird.
No.
Almost twice as many Australians want the stage 3 income tax cuts scrapped as those who want to keep them. The Australian Institute released a poll which found 41% of people support the Albanese government repealing the tax cuts, compared with 22% who are opposed. 61% of Australians thought adapting economic policy to suit changing circumstances was more important than keeping an election promise.
Can I just say, though, because I think if Labor does end up changing their mind on this, whether it's to scrap the cuts or to tinker with them a little bit, that when they fucking come out with, oh, it's changing economic circumstances, I actually think that's a little bit of a bullshit argument.
It's
because
absolute bullshit,
Yeah, inequality has been fucking rife for years. Yes, like the economy has changed, you know, with COVID, and it is like it's always fucking changing though. But the fundamental fact remains the same, that it's an unequal society, and these tax cuts would have led to more inequality. It's not like some sudden new, global force has dictated that because of the interest rates and inflation and blah, then now we can't have this tax cut. No, that's bullshit.
Yeah. Oh, it's so different to 2018. 2018 when wages had been stagnant for a decade, when the median family income was lower in 2018 than it was in 2009, for fuck's sake.
Yeah.
When we were already a super unequal society. Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. That is so frustrating. Obviously, it's an excuse. Obviously, they're using political cover in order to potentially change their approach to this. And if that results in them changing it, then whatever. But yes, no, listeners are serious danger. And the real heads should be very aware that that is fucking bullshit. Labor should have been opposed to these tax cuts from the get-go. And they don't get a cookie for now saying that, in this current circumstance, then maybe we shouldn't give shitloads of money to rich people.
Smart, adapting to the market. Like, they're just looking for an excuse.
Just a final point on this opinion poll. 43% of respondents who identified as Labor voters supported the tax being ditched. Of the respondents who identified as Greens voters, 54% wanted the cut scrapped.
But Tom,
yes,
don't you think that's bizarre? This is literally like a core, I would even say like the core thing that the Greens are campaigning on right now is scrap the tax cuts for the rich. And just over half of our voters support that.
Want it scratched, yeah. That is bizarre. But it's higher than Labor, which I think is good.
I know. I don't know. But yeah, it's concerning to me. What are those 46% thinking?
Well, yeah. I don't know whether in these respondents' minds there's a difference between ditching the stage 3 tax cuts entirely or changing them. I don't know. Maybe that opens up
I
some
would
other
love
space.
to know more detail of that. That's fucking Jesus Christ, Greens voters. Are you fucking kidding me? You people sometimes love you, but can't live. Greens voters can't live with them. Can't live without them. You know what I mean?
Fire and Blood, being a history of the Targaryen kings of Westeros. Transcribed by George R.R. Martin. The Queen wore a green gown. Note was taken, and thereafter it became custom to refer to Greens when talking of the Queen's party.
Now, if Labor does this, if something happens, if they suddenly say, "Hey, no, actually, we're like Marxists now or whatever, and we shouldn't give these tax cuts to rich people," that would be them doing a good thing, which would make us feel confused. We wouldn't know what to do. What do we do?
Yeah, I would be confused. What do we do? Well, it's like I wanted to have a bigger conversation about this because it would be very typical of this approach that Labor seem to have lately. That it's just so like finger to the wind, confusing. It almost feels like they're playing games with me. Specifically confusing me and trying to like be like, he didn't think I was going to do that, did you?
Backflip.
Backflip. But like clearly this is more than anything a sign that there is significant variation in, to put it kindly, or maybe disunity and disagreement, to put it another way, within the Labor Party when it comes to politics and policy. Right?
Certainly, yes. Well, when you've got those sort of backbenchers coming out and saying, no, it's actually good that we stick with them and election promises are more important than exacerbating inequality in this country, even though we are the party of the worker and we want a better future for everyone.
Yeah. Is Doug Cameron the semi-good Labor? He has come out saying that the tax cuts are bad, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's retired as well. He's not in there anymore. So.
Yeah, true. But like, he's a Labor guy. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I wonder, Labor seems to be more and more a broad church in the way that the Liberals are meant to be. Like, are they I would say they cover more scope of politics than the Liberal Party now.
The Labor Party generally, in like the Parliamentary Labor Party?
Well, no, not just Parliament, like as in including the membership.
Right. I think they have. Do they have more members? I forget what the coalition.
I think they do.
Maybe, yeah.
But like, do you know what I mean? That like, yeah, they're kind of maybe they say it as a good thing that they're trying to occupy that space that the Liberal Party said that they wanted to occupy, which is being a broad church and like creating space for all of these different political views. Really meaning standing for fucking nothing. They stand for fucking nothing. And so, but then, would they be like, yeah, that's our political strategy, is to be so fucking void of principles, politics, values, that you never know what we're going to do next. We're going to be unpredictable, and that's a good thing in politics, right? If you're confused about what we stand for, that's good.
I guess for people on the left of the party, they can be like, hey, you never know. We might suddenly do something progressive. Watch out. It's a fun game, to surprise people and be like, oh, fuck, they actually did something good.
Yeah, I mean, that's what they do. Like, I think that's what they're doing with this fucking weird language that they're using around the tax cuts and different Labor MPs saying different things. They have done it with a bunch of things in Queensland recently, which, like, I want to go into soon. But I'm curious, like, if they do end up scrapping the tax cuts, how do you think that the Greens should respond to that?
Woo! Have a party. Look, there is this classic meme that Labor hacks like to use, which is Greens, the Greens taking credit for things. But the stage 2 tax cuts to me is a pristine example, a clear example of the Greens consistently, furiously campaigning, constantly raising awareness, even though I hate that phrase, but constantly centering these tax cuts as a travesty, as how unjust they are, or, going to the PBO and getting all this modelling and sort of saying, okay, just how fucked up are these tax cuts? Just how much are they going to benefit men over women? How sexist are they? How unequal they are, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously working in tandem with the likes of the Australia Institute and some other progressive people generally, as Adam pointed out in that tweet, with the union movement. Like Union said, we should scrap the stage 3 tax cuts at the Job Summit. That went nowhere, obviously, but maybe it helped in the general campaign against these things. I think the Greens could be extremely satisfied, could congratulate Labor on doing the right thing, and also claim victory. That's a big political win, I think,
Yeah, I think it's funny, the Greens taking credit for things thing is funny because there's an element of truth to it, right? Like, it's a classic Greens trope. But I also think it's such a, like, political class thing, because a lot of the time where that comes from is other organizations, whether it's like unions or NGOs, who are like working behind the scenes and like just, having meetings with ministers, but being too afraid to criticize them publicly. Yeah. And they're like, well, actually, we won this. And so we're pissed off that you guys are taking credit for it when it was us, and we want to take credit for it. So it's not even, it's actually just, it's like a competitive thing, which makes me laugh. And I think it's just silly, isn't it?
I think we should always respond with Greens taking credit for things should be responded with Labor avoiding responsibility for things too. Labor loves to avoid actually copying the blame for all the bad shit they do. But
yeah. I think it's undeniable that, like, obviously it is so fucking blatant that the federal election has scared them, and they care about nothing more than they do about their longevity, their sustainability as a party, and the security of their seats. So, like, electoral pressure is the number one thing that will make change when it comes to Labor. That's a fact.
Totally. And it is, as we talked about, they are getting squeezed between their fear of losing seats to their left, to the Greens, and their unshakable belief that the only way to win an election is to be right wing.
Yeah, that's
those
so true.
Those are two forces that cannot. It's a fundamental contradiction there. Something's going to explode there, and hopefully that results in a federal Labor Greens coalition government. Yeah.
Well, and one of the first things, though, this is where it's interesting to me, one of the first areas that these parties will often cede ground to the Greens on is the environment. It's the classic, like, kind of almost non-threatening element of the Greens platform, I think, is the environment. And we've seen this even with the LNP. I notice in seats that we are either a threat to the LNP in Queensland or have taken their seat and they're trying to win it back, what they'll adopt from our platform is that environmental focus, whether that's because they genuinely think that is why people voted for us, or probably even more to the point because, that's the thing that still allows them to maintain, like, their actual position, their values and their purpose as a party, which is to serve capital and maintain the existing economic system and status quo. So Labor, I think, is increasingly, they're willing to talk about climate change more. They're willing to go further on climate change. They're willing to go further on environmental issues. It will be really interesting to see whether they actually go further when it comes to tax cuts. But they have already, just this week, the federal government, they announced their new threatened species and biodiversity plan. It sets a 0 new extinctions target and a new target for protected areas, 30% of all land and seas protected by 2030, and it says that they're going to acquire, millions of hectares of new land. It's a massive plan. Like the current agreed target for protected areas is 17%. We're already above that. I think they say like 20 to 22% is already protected. But this would be a massive change, and no new extinctions is obviously a big goal, and they're going to be buying up a lot of land in the next 5 years.
It's such a funny phrase, though. All right,
No
guys,
new
no new extinctions, okay?
I know.
That's it. There's been you've had too many extinctions now.
More. Yeah.
That's enough. By
It is.
2030,
Well,
cut
yeah,
it
that's
out.
true.
Cut
It's like
it
a little
out.
It is a little sad of me to be like, that's a big goal. No new extinctions. Like it shouldn't be. But it is. It would require a massive change on the part of the government to do that, because we are so rapidly barreling towards many new extinctions.
Right. Guys, we've got a zero tolerance approach to murder now, okay? No more murders from 2030.
Extinctions.
We're going to
Knock it
phase out
off.
murder.
Extinctions of threatened species. Australia says no. But yeah, like even though this is a classic, it's good, but experts say it's nowhere near enough. So the money that they've actually allocated to this, it's $225 million. The evidence says that we would need at least like $1.7 billion. So quite a lot more, but only, a fraction of the tax cuts, just quietly.
That's like the $1 billion that we leave off between
That's the
243
one, exactly.
and
We don't even know.
244
That's the margin of error. It's literally like the margin of error when we're talking about the tax cuts. But the way that they're doing it, like they've picked a few special species, their favorites that they're going to protect. And there's this article kind of laying out why this plan is not good enough in the conversation, which we can link in the show notes by, I think, 3 ecologists or academics. And they're like, when you pick specific species to protect, it means that the rest will probably be left behind. Like, you need an overall approach that actually takes into account the thousands of threatened species that you're going to target. They're also saying,
it also seems rude, just like
it's
pick out your
mean.
favorites.
Yeah. I can understand why they would, though. There was a picture in this article of one of the things that they want to protect. I've never seen this before. It was like this underwater creature, and it had a long saw. Shut up. It has saw nose. It was like a long saw. You know what I mean?
Well, I'm not going to body shame a fish.
This was stunning. You have to see this picture, guys. Click on the conversation article link just to see this thing that has a long saw nose. Anyway, I'm surprised it's still alive, because like that thing has to get in the way. It's probably, maybe we need to have a conversation about whether these creatures are meant to still be maybe they're meant to be extinct. Cut that out.
And all these races, do we really need them?
Eugenics for species. That's right. Yeah. Wow. Really fucked up of the government to pick their favorite races of threatened species. Anyway, only around 6% of listed threatened species under this plan are slated to receive this priority funding. So it's not enough. And the other thing that this article points out is that we still have really shitty environmental laws that allow stuff like, mass clearing and destruction of the environment that will fuck over these threatened species anyway, with practically no consequences for corporations.
Great.
So it's like, yeah, it's good for labor, but is it really good? My question, did the Greens respond to this at all, this threatened species plan? Do you know?
Not that I saw. I only saw the celebration of, or the, very positive coverage for Plibisec and this plan from Labor,
Yeah. Do you get tired of the motif, like, this is a good step, but it's nowhere near enough?
Well,
it's sleepy. I get sleepy sometimes.
It's tough. On the climate front, it's fun. It's crucial. It's like, there are incrementalism, and this is better than the status quo doesn't actually cut it when it comes to averting climate catastrophe, for example. Like every degree of warming that we avoid makes a huge difference. And, once warming gets to a certain level, you get those feedback loops, and you sort of lock in even more devastation by doing stuff. So I am so glad that the Greens have consistently been sort of saying, we need to listen to the science, which apparently was what we're all doing.
Yeah.
But we actually need to listen to the license to figure out what the outcome is. When it comes to species protection, obviously we would love all species, to be protected, and no species should go extinct, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think it is slightly pardon the pun, different kettle of fish, in that every species protection that you introduce is good, and that's fair enough, and you can celebrate that and endorse that, congratulate that, or back that in, support that fully. But obviously, at the end, if your broader goal is to try and protect as many species as possible, and do that by limiting corporate power and strengthening environmental protection laws, then yeah, totally, you should make that point too.
I guess my question is more like, how important is it to give Labor praise when they do something good? Like, are they a dog that we are trying to condition? Will that work? Is there any benefit of this is a good step but part of that equation?
What do you think?
What do I think? Well, I do think that the public has an idea of the Greens as being consistently negative and always just saying that things are bad, and we're always grumpy and sad about something, and that makes people feel grumpy and sad. No one wants to be around that negative energy. And so, like, I think sometimes, if we only focus on the problems with something, we risk reinforcing that frame. That's my only fear about, like, that for me is the only reason to be like, look, this is a good step up, because I think we need to be like, no, we're a hopeful party and we can win things. And that's why we say we've had this win. It's not necessarily to be like, aren't the Greens so great? It's to be like, look, good things happen, but like Labor is still shit. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, there's not much point in the Greens saying Labor have done a great thing here. The end. Don't bother calling a press conference in that instance.
No,
I mean, and when there is these critiques, as you've laid out here, as to the ways in which this is failing, then pointing them out is really good, and also because it ties into a broader story that we tell about the fact that Labor's ambition, Labor's vision, Labor's policy agenda is curtailed. It is limited by by the fact that they are beholden to corporate donors. Okay, so whenever they don't go far enough, even though they could go further, particularly on the environmental front, I think that we can tell a pretty compelling story as to, just the limits to the Labor Party agenda. Okay, and it is limited by the fact that they take money from the very same corporations that profit from trashing our own environment. That's part of the Green story as well. So offering that critique, I think that's useful, and we can gain out of that.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think any idea that we would be better off just saying that Labor are great and making them feel good when they do a good thing, because that means they'll do more good things to feel good. Absolutely bullshit, particularly if it were coming from the Greens. They do not give a shit, and they don't want us to just, like us saying that they're good is not going to fix Labor. But us winning seats, I think it does fucking help to fix Labor at least a little bit. And case in point, Queensland Labor last week did something very uncharacteristically good on climate. They released their long-awaited 10-year energy plan, and it includes, this is massive for Queensland Labor, so significant additional investment in renewable energy, transmission infrastructure, storage, the world's largest pumped hydro project they're going to build in Queensland near Mackay. It includes an energy workers charter with job security guarantee and access to reskilling and redeployment via workforce pooling. Exactly what we have been saying pretty much that they should be doing. It almost, Energy Transition Authority, who? Like, that is exactly what the federal bill that Penny Allman-Payne has introduced is kind of saying that we need for our energy workers. Queensland Labor are kind of doing that. That's pretty incredible. It includes an increased renewable energy target, so 70% by 2032 instead of 50% by 2030. It includes electricity sector emissions reduction target of 50% by 2030 and 90% by 2035 to 36. That's only for the electricity sector, I will say, though. Just keep that in mind.
Sure.
And perhaps like most astounding of all for anyone who has been following Queensland politics and Queensland Labor's position on climate and energy is that they say that they will bring forward coal-fired power station closures by repurposing them, quote unquote, repurposing them into renewable energy hubs by 2035. So for folks who aren't across the situation in Queensland, like, we own our energy generators. They're publicly owned, which is one good thing about Queensland. That's fucking cool. Yeah. Obviously, we should own those assets. And it means that, the government can decide when those assets will be retired. The timelines for our coal-fired power stations at the moment, or before this plan was released, had some continuing to burn coal beyond 2050. There's one that didn't even have a closure date listed. Like they're talking about closing in, decades from now. And the Energy Minister, Mick de Brenny, has been the Greens have repeatedly pressed him on this and said, obviously, there are all these reports that say that we need to fucking close these power stations earlier if we want to meet our climate targets. And more to the point, like the market shows that we need to close these power stations early. Like early closures are happening across the country. You need to start planning for these so that those workers aren't left out in the cold when this needs to happen. And the minister repeatedly, unequivocally said, we will not bring forward the closure of our coal-fired power stations. When asked about this energy plan, he repeatedly said, and I'm talking literally like in the last month or two, the plan will not include early closure of those power stations, of those generators. And so, you know, and I knew, not to toot my own horn, but like I fucking predicted this, that I was like, I heard whispers that they would bring it forward and we're like, well, how can they do that by not breaking a promise? And I was like, they'll say they're not closing them, they're repurposing them because they'll reuse those sites for something else. And that's what they've ended up doing. So they can say they haven't necessarily backflipped, but like it's absolutely a backflip. Like it is very clear from all of the statements that the government has made that they did not want to bring forward those closures, and they are.
The coal-fired power plant, it's still going. It's just not using coal, okay? It's just that they're doing renewable energy, but the power station's still open, so we haven't been backflipped, and you haven't owned us.
Yeah. We're not owned. Yeah.
Not owned.
Yeah. I mean, like, the other thing is they're not even necessarily saying that they'll stop burning coal by 2035. They've kind of done some weasel words where they're like, we won't be reliant on coal by 2035. So we may still have the capacity to burn coal if we need to, but like most coal-fired power stations are clearly fucking closing. This isn't like a radical change. This isn't like, oh my God, they're showing such leadership on climate here. This is so incredible. It's kind of just Queensland Labor catching up, but it is really significant. And I think that the Energy Workers Charter is really significant. And that is actually kind of like that is some real leadership in this area. And this is the bit where I go, but
okay.
Well, first, it's not all good. The emissions reduction targets for the Queensland government are still pretty much the same as the former LNP, former federal Liberal government. They were, 26 to 28% reduction by 2030. Ours is still 30% by 2030.
Oh, wow.
Wah, wah. Net zero by 2050. Absolutely shithouse. This plan, it still includes new gas developments. The speed of this transition is nowhere near what we need to keep warming at 1.5 degrees as per the Paris Agreement. And critically, this plan, you know, this is about energy, it's about domestic energy. So it's reasonable to say that this wouldn't necessarily affect this, but the government is still very actively saying they will approve new coal and gas projects and they will continue to mine and export fossil fuels indefinitely. No end date. Pretending that that's not their problem when it will contribute to dangerous fucking global heating and absolutely kill us. So there's that part, the it's not good enough thing.
Check.
Check. I've done that. Yep. I'm legally required as a Greens member to point out that this is not all that good. But I'm also legally required to point out that not only is this a massive backflip on the part of Queensland Labor on key issues for them, but it is uncannily similar to what the Greens were calling for. So in the lead up to the release of this 10-year plan, the Queensland Greens had released like a wish list. They had asked for some specific things. The specific things that they asked for: stronger emissions reduction targets, a timeline to close coal-fired power stations by 2030, and a worker support package with a job guarantee, access to reskilling, and redeployment. You know, like this plan includes progress at least on all three of those areas.
Yeah.
Coincidence?
Coincidence much?
What do you think? Like...
No, I mean, that's great. And I think it is an endlessly frustrating situation which you cannot directly draw a link between this to this. Of course, Labor will never admit that they're taking any kind of policy pressure or that any political pressure from the Greens or the broader environmental movement or anyone to their left is actually working. But it's clear to see that that's there. And I don't know what other option there is, other than to fight for what we believe in and constantly calling out and painting the better vision that we want. I mean, even just listening to all this, I was thinking like the idea that the Greens are always painted as the negative ones who are saying no or that's not good enough or whatever. It's like really Labor is the party of no. Labor is constantly telling us why we can't have better things.
We're not going to do that. We can't do that. Yeah.
And I think hanging on to our positive vision for the better future as the Greens is really important. So that's good. I think, the Michael Berkman response to this might be illustrative. Like he tweeted out saying, yesterday Queensland Labor made a pretty massive about-face on climate. They're finally talking about closing coal power stations, cutting emissions, giving energy workers a job guarantee. Make no mistake, we wouldn't have seen this if not for the federal election result. Labor has been copying the Greens' homework and nothing makes me happier. So being like, yes, the Greens have played a massive role in this, but credit to Labor for doing the right thing. Is that kind of his approach?
Well, according to the people in the replies to this tweet, Michael Berkman is just obsessed with himself. And there are a lot of people saying, I think there was one that said, you might not get this, Michael, but not everything is about you. Other people saying this is Pete Greens taking credit for things. The Greens had absolutely nothing to do with this. I think that those people are wrong, but I also think I think it is interesting that when you look at those people who are saying those things, a lot of them were union members. And as I understand it, it's true that the unions, and particularly the Electrical Trades Union, ETU, who are actually a pretty good union, were they not still fucking Labor aligned, they fought really fucking hard for this, particularly for that energy workers charter, right? And that job guarantee. And it's a massive win for them. And I'm sure that they worked very hard and they deserve credit. But again, it's like, is this a competition about who deserves credit for the thing? Or is it like, look, clearly these things are all working on Labor. Let's keep doing them because this is a fucking, life or death situation in many ways and we need to keep going.
Yeah, well, it should be a victory for the climate. Okay, so your goal should be better climate action across the board, and you'll take that in whatever form you can get it. And whether it is the unions, whether it is the Greens, whether it's other civil society groups, it is evidence of political pressure and organizing with people and fighting for something and articulating that. The idea that you'd be like, oh, it was just the unions that won this and the Greens had absolutely nothing to do with it, or the idea that the Greens haven't in some way shaped the climate debate or don't represent an important part of the movement for climate justice, that's crazy. That's ridiculous. Of course, the Greens are a massive part of that.
Yeah.
As I say, you cannot always draw a direct line from A to B and be like, this speech that Michael gave on this date is what changed the Queensland Labor government's approach. Of course not.
No.
But to suggest that it's just the Greens, that's ridiculous as well. Obviously, we shouldn't play into that game. I think when Adam was talking about the stage 3 tax cuts, he's sort of listing all the groups across civil society that were fighting that have recognised the fact that these stage 3 tax cuts are ridiculous and should be done. The Greens are there, absolutely part of that movement. But no, of course we can't win it alone and we can't get these massive changes without broad support and broad pressure on Labor governments.
Yeah. And there's this other thing that I have been thinking about a lot lately and talking to people about, where I think we also the Greens risk getting really into and addicted to the sugar hit of like the Greens win thing, where we push for something and then we get it and we can claim it as a win. And then using that to actually to form our strategy. So prioritizing issues or reforms that we think that a government is about to move on, rather than pushing our own platform, even if it might not be something that either major party is about to move on in the next fucking decade. I think maybe I touched on this last week when we talk about pushing just for legalizing cannabis, because maybe we think that that's something that Labor might be about to get into because they're seeing that it's actually fairly publicly acceptable, when theoretically, like from a policy perspective, I'm not sure whether we should be carving out just cannabis from other drugs and treating them as a different issue. Or, when we talk about raising the age and making that campaign about raising the age to 14, because that's what the groups, the NGOs have been campaigning for, and what there is support internally, at least, or from members in Labor. Yeah, that I think we have to be really wary of just picking off, this is what Labor's about to move on, so that's what we're going to campaign on now.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I quite see it the same way. I mean, I think you and I have very different ideas about how close we are to legalising cannabis in this country. I mean, again, look at the response from the Labor government to that latest Greens push. It was just a flat-out rejection. It's just not going to happen. I don't see any state Labor government other than the ACT coalition government with the Greens.
They always do first.
Yeah, but I
don't know. They always say – that's what I mean though. Like so much recently we've seen Labor act as though they're nowhere near it, but – we know that there is a lot of pressure internally for them to move on it. And they do sometimes.
I'm not sure how that factors into the fact that the Greens are now only in a position, are still at this stage, only in a position to enact legislative change through pressures on Labor governments. That's literally our only option at this stage.
Well,
like across the board is that's the only way we get anything done.
But do you isn't that or is it just about dressing for the job that you want, not the job you have? But something about not just acting like what you are right now, but performing the role of the thing that you want to be. So are we just performing the role of a party whose only job is to push Labor over the line on reforms that maybe they would have done eventually, or to accelerate those reforms, bring them forward? Or is our role to be pushing to be a party of government who has our own agenda that we actually want to achieve for transformative economic and, social change? And I think actually that there are a lot of benefits for Labor in relegating the Greens to a party who are just a party of pressure rather than a party of power. They're not a party of government. They're kind of irrelevant in that way. The only way that they exist is in relation to us, a major party of government. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I also remember the history, right? Remember how ahead of the curve the Greens were on same-sex marriage, on a anti-corruption commission. So there were those points where we were way ahead of the pack on these certain policy issues that then eventually move into the political centre ground or become into the frame of the Overton window or what have you. Again, we never, the Greens never get credit for doing that, or we're too radical and you need to bring people with you, yada yada yada, as if advocating for what you believe in isn't a part of that process. So I think that is quite frustrating. I mean, it'll be interesting with this housing negotiation, right? Like Max and Adam are going into negotiations with Labor to talk about their housing bill. And they're listing out their demands of way more public housing, doing that rental freeze, which we talked about before, and capping rents. If out of that negotiation process they can get anything close to that, that will be pretty extraordinary, I think, and that'll be a good example of the Greens making a huge material difference to those kind of legislative moves. So I still think that's really valuable. And I'd also say that advocating for the legalizing of cannabis doesn't rule out or undermine a broader campaign of approaching drugs as a health issue and a more harm reduction approach to drugs necessarily. It is just zeroing in on one particular substance that has more broader public support than others do.
But there is an explicit strategy in that campaign to not use the health framing when it comes to cannabis. So, but yeah, I think, I don't know. I mean, let's talk about housing, because it's true that, yes, obviously part of the role of our parliamentarians is to negotiate with government where they can to improve something that they're already doing. But is that what we actively campaign on? I think that, no, arguably the right thing, and for, Max and for our housing spokespersons across the country to be pushing for those radical changes that the major parties aren't even willing to touch yet, like a rent freeze. And doing all of those things at once, I think, is a good strategy. Because, yeah, the complicating factor around all of this is that Labor is still quite bad overall. In Queensland Labor, yes, they did this, this energy plan came out last week. That was quite good. But at the same time, they've just said that they're going to build probably another youth prison for children as young as fucking 10 years old in Queensland. And the same week that they released this energy plan, they scrapped this land tax thing. You saw this, Tom. I don't know how many people saw this. It probably didn't get as much coverage as it should have. But you want to talk about a fucking backflip? Labor had proposed this change to take into account interstate land holdings when calculating land tax for investors. So to stop them from just owning, they could be very wealthy, own a bunch of properties all across the country, but skirt in under the thresholds for land tax in each of those jurisdictions and end up paying none. And Queensland said, well, no, we want to take that into account. And obviously the investors did not like this because it was closing a loophole that they were using. And so there was this massive campaign, particularly in Queensland. I've seen this because it was just, every edition of the Courier Mail would have something from the real estate lobby about how badly this is going to fuck over everyone, pretending that it'll fuck over renters because developers and landlords will move out of the state and then those houses will disappear, whatever fucking argument they love to use.
Mm-hmm.
And so after this incredible campaign from the real estate lobby and the News Corp papers, then at the end of last week, the Premier suddenly goes, actually, yeah, we're going to scrap it. We're not going to do it.
What did she say? She said she talked to other premiers because they needed other premiers to sort of help out with the tax arrangements. And the other premiers said, we're not going to do that. And therefore, Queensland Labor says it wouldn't work. Was that the general vibe?
Yeah, so that had already been happening. Like other premiers, I think the New South Wales Premier was like, well, I'm not going to give you the details of investors in my state who would be eligible under these new rules. And the Treasurer, Queensland Treasurer, Cameron Dick, had consistently said, okay, fine, we're still going to do this. We will rely on self-reporting. Obviously not a perfect system, but that's generally how taxation works in this country. Rely on self-reporting and push ahead. And yet the argument that, or like the line that Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk took when she ended up scrapping this, it was at some dinner, some meeting that she had with a bunch of premiers. And she was like, well, I was talking to them and they said that they wouldn't help us out. And so I eventually decided to scrap it. And everyone's like, oh, okay. And I think it's so telling that, like the AFR article about this says the decision to scrap the change was welcomed by investors who described it as a victory for common sense. But it came after weeks of headlines about the change turning investors away from Queensland, pushing up rents and exacerbating the state's housing crisis. Absolutely. Like, how the fuck is the real estate lobby still so incredibly effective at this bullshit spin about them being needed in a state to save us from the housing crisis when they are the ones who caused it? How?
Well, it's still like we went back to, what is it? 70% of people with investment properties are mum and dad investors or whatever. They only have one investment property. That is still just a reality of the political economy in Australia. So it is able to paint itself as, an ordinary thing, and investors aren't evil demons.
But this wouldn't have affected them.
Why not?
Because it would only affect them if they had another investment property in another state that then bumped them up over the threshold in total.
Yeah, right. Great. The real estate lobby is good because they're rich and they represent rich people.
Yeah. They're really fucking powerful. Like, I think really there's not enough account taken of how powerful the real estate lobby is. Absolutely on par with the fossil fuel lobby, I would say. And in Queensland in particular, I've seen this time and again, the REIQ, the Real Estate Institute of Queensland, they convinced Labor to scrap these significant renters reforms, including ending no grounds evictions in 2019 to 20. Labor had done all this consultation. They announced these reforms in 2019 and that was at the end of the year, and a few months of campaigning from the REIQ, and suddenly in 2020 they scrapped them and they ended up doing far less. And what was so frustrating though is that then somehow Labor still gets credit in the media for passing renters reforms, and some of them even think that they ended no grounds evictions when they didn't, which I guess, shows the importance again of the Greens doing the, holding them to account on that, because no one else fucking will.
Yeah. It's very interesting times. I mean, all the polling would suggest that Labor's going to win the New South Wales state election next year. Anything could happen, of course. If that happens, then you've got Labor governments in every single state and territory except Tasmania. So that's pretty fucking massive. And still in lots of other states, Greens have very, very few representatives and don't quite have the same chance to cut through. There's a decent chance that the Greens might pick up some state seats in Victoria this year and maybe New South Wales as well next year. So, you're going to have wall-to-wall Labor, federal and state pretty much. And Labor's going to do some good things. And so this is going to come up time and again. But it might not surprise you that I think our conclusion is the Greens are still good, and we still like that the Greens are there, who can claim victory where we can, but also continue to hold Labor to account and call them out when they're being shit.
Well, and also I think still keep eye on the prize and keep fighting for the big shit that no one else is even willing to talk about, because both major parties are beholden to capital and are neoliberal parties in an economic sense, and so we need to fight for the big shit.
And play the long game. Again, the lesson that I think Labor still cannot reckon with, that there is political capital and a political benefit to standing for something and fighting for what you believe in, regardless of how attacked you are for it. By saying a consistent message over a long period of time, these are our principles, this is what we believe in. You know, we're not going to change in a weather vane depending on current economic circumstances or really political circumstances at any one moment. We believe in this stuff. This is why we get into politics. We want a better world. This is what we're fighting for. And we will fight for that for decades and decades and decades. And we'll say the same thing again and again. People respect that, I think.
Hear, hear.
Don't worry. I have a plan.
I'm going to jump!
No!
Do a flip!
Poverty. Knock it off.
Stop it, guys, please. The call to action this week, get ready because Monday, October 17th, that is tomorrow week, if you're listening to this on the day it comes out, is the International Day to Eradicate Poverty. Let's bloody fucking fuck it off, thanks.
Yeah.
On that day, the Anti-Poverty Centre, the Australian Unemployed Workers Union, the Anti-Poverty Network SA, and Get Up are hosting actions in LA to put pressure on Social Services Minister Amanda Rishworth to, of course, raise Centrelink payments to above the Henderson poverty line, which is currently $88 a day. That is, of course, Greens policy. It just makes sense because poverty's bad and we're giving tax cuts to rich people, maybe. So that makes no sense.
Either way, yeah.
Bad. Those folks are meeting in Elder Park at 12:30 p.m. We'll put a link in the show notes if you're in Adelaide and you can make it along there. Again, specifically pressuring Amanda Rishworth there. If you're elsewhere in the country or you can't be in Adelaide on October the 17th, then consider joining the Unemployed Workers Union, unemployedworkersunion.com. My understanding is they recently changed their sort of organising structure so that you can become a member in a different way with voting rights and all that kind of stuff. More details, if you are unemployed, if you want to join as a solidarity member, you can do that as well. unemployedworkersunion.com. They do fantastic, consistent organising, calling for very basic stuff, which is that just because you don't have a job doesn't mean you should be treated like shit or live in poverty in one of the richest countries in the world. Seems fair enough to me.
Absolutely. Otherwise, thanks, friends, for listening. Please remember you can email us things. You can email us ideas and thoughts. hello@seriousdangerpod.com. You can find us on all the socials at seriousdangerau. Leave us a review. Sign up to the Patreon if you want to hear us. We had a fantastic fucking chat with Cam Wilson about the Conservative Conference, CPAC, and all the wild and wacky shit that those crazy cats are up to. So just $3 a month. You should head over and check it out.
Thanks, mates. Bye.
Bye, comrades.
Serious danger to Australia.